Good morning everyone, my name is Tjipto and today I will be baking a cake for my AIMS video project. That cake is called Sacher Torte. It was made famous by a man called Franz Sacher, who served it to a prince called Clemens von Metternich. It was so good that the cake is now a Viennese culinary specialty. Now, there is no actual recipe of this cake anywhere, so I'm going to have to improvise a bit. Looking at the video, it looks like a standard chocolate cake with a layer of apricot jam in between. So let's begin to the first step, cracking some eggs. So first of all, you want to separate the egg whites and the yolk. The yolk will be mixed in with the initial chocolate base, while the whites will be whipped into airy, fluffy peaks, which will serve to lighten the cake and make it not so crumbly. Now, after you're done separating the eggs, we will begin with the chocolate base in which we will mix in our egg yolk. For the chocolate base, you will need some butter and chocolate that we will melt over a bain-marie, and as you can see, we have the water boiling on the back. Now, we begin with measuring about 3 ounces of butter and about 6 ounces of chocolate. You can measure the amount of butter you use, but I've been cooking for way longer than you guys have, probably, and can measure it out pretty easily by eye. So, we want to break the chocolate into fairly small pieces, but it doesn't have to be too small since we don't have to worry too much about the optimal temperature for it to shine or anything like that. As long as it melts, it's good. Going back to the egg whites, as I said before, we will whisk this into stiff peaks. For that to happen, we need to get a tiny pinch of salt or a 1/4 teaspoon and about 6 tablespoons of sugar. We will then begin by first whisking the egg whites without the sugar and salt mixture until it gets nice and foamy. Now, it is very important that we add the sugar in batches to allow the sugar to dissolve and for it to be distributed evenly among the egg whites. We will continue this long rigorous process until we have stiff peaks. After setting aside the egg whites, we can now begin on the yolks, and we want to aerate them as we did with the egg whites until it doubles in volume. We immediately add 2 tablespoons of sugar onto the eggs and begin whisking until it leaves ribbons when whisked. I would like to note that whenever any form of whisking is necessary, you can just use an electric mixer. I was too stubborn to get one and now I'm paying the price for it. After the egg yolks have doubled in volume, we then begin adding a tablespoon at a time of the chocolate mixture we had made before into the egg yolks. This allows it to lighten up and allow the egg yolks to take up the chocolate. Once we add about 2 to 3 tablespoons of the chocolate mixture into the egg yolks, we can then dump it all into the larger chocolate bowl and mix it in there. Next, we need to measure out 1/3 of a cup of flour, and the most important step in all of this is that the flour must be sifted. If it is not, then it will cause our cakes to become lumpy. We then whisk this to incorporate all of the flour into the chocolate base. Our final step to finishing our chocolate cake is to mix in the egg whites. We take about 1/3 of the egg whites and mix it into the chocolate base. We do not have to be so gentle yet, as the quicker we can incorporate it, the less lumpier it will be. Once fully incorporated, the remaining egg whites is the time to be gentle. Use a spatula and fold it in very carefully, as we do not want to bash in any of the air bubbles we had rigorously created when whisking the egg whites earlier. We will continue to fold the egg whites until fully homogeneous. Do not forget to apply a generous coating of butter and flour onto the cake tin to prevent it from sticking. A cake that sticks onto the tin is far from ideal. Finally, we can gently pour in the chocolate cake mix into the well-oiled cake tin and bake at 370 degrees Fahrenheit for about 40 minutes. Or poking the center of the cake yields no wet batter. While the cake is baking, we can move on to the layer of apricots. While I would have preferred making my own apricot jam from scratch, because I assume that is what the recipe calls for, apricots were not in season, so I have decided to use 1 entire jar of apricot preserves along with a few tablespoons of apricot brandy and adding it into a food processor to get it all nice and smooth. Just an FYI, this can be made way in advance as it would keep in the fridge for a very long time.
After that's done, we can then move on to making the chocolate glaze. And for that, we need another 6 ounces of chocolate, about 3 tablespoons of butter, and 4 tablespoons of heavy cream. We add the butter and 6 ounces of chocolate that we will break into tiny pieces into a bowl. We then heat up the cream and bring it up to a boil. After it boils, we will immediately kill the heat and mix the cream into the chocolate and butter until it all melts.
Do not forget to take out the cake out of the oven once it's done. And there you go. All the pieces of the cake are now done and we can finally build the Sasher Tort. However, before we build, we must rest to allow it to cool so we don't burn our precious little fingers. In the meantime, we must make the garnish, the perfect whipped cream. And to get it perfect, we must make sure all the utensils are cold, which allows us to whip up the cream much more quickly. Next, the flavorings. I'm using fresh vanilla pods here, but you can just use a teaspoon of vanilla extract. However, if you're using the fresh stuff, you must first split it open into half, and then scraping out the little seeds and adding it into your bowl. So, into the bowl with the vanilla in it, we will measure about 1 cup of heavy cream and add some sugar. For that, we will need 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar. It is imperative to use the powdered form as it has a little bit of cornstarch which helps us whip it into the perfect airy creams of perfection. As you can see, perfectly airy and fluffy. Don't forget to taste it, and do remember that we will be using this to garnish our cakes, so please resist the urge to consume it all in one sitting. Now that our cake is fully... Oh god, is that my face? Sorry about that. Going back to the topic at hand, now that our cake is fully rested, we can unmold it onto a rack in which we will split it in half to spread our apricot jam. Remember to spread it as evenly as possible. This way, we will not get a clump of apricot jam in one bite and a bite of only cake in another. Once you've done that, we will close it off with the top half of the cake and spread even more jam on top of the cake. Now, I did use a little too much jam here, so don't add as much as I did or it would make the cake a bit too tart. So, now that we're done with this step, we will let this rest and allow the cake to absorb the apricot jam for about 30 minutes before glazing the cake with our rich chocolate sauce. So, after resting for 30 minutes, we will now begin the final step, the glazing. Now, if your chocolate glaze has hardened, we can just put it over a bain-marie to melt it again and make it pourable. Then, all we have to do is spread it as evenly as possible and then let it rest again for at least 30 minutes to allow the sauce to harden. As you can see, I am attempting to smooth it out to no avail. My cake baked sort of unevenly and it had cracked prior as I was not careful when handling it. But it doesn't matter too much. Now that 30 minutes has elapsed, it's cake time. If you noticed, I am wearing different pajamas. I had a little bit of snafu trying to extract the cake off its bottom mold and dropped it on my previous pajama. Anyways, slice your cake, extract it very carefully, and gently place it on one side and add a dollop of our perfect whipped cream on the other. Try to make it look as presentable as best you can, and there you go! My interpretation of the Sasher Tort that they serve in Vienna. It won't come close, but I think it should be close enough for a domestic home kitchen. Now, time for the taste test. And I gotta say, not bad for my first try. I'm not that great of a baker, so I kinda wanted to challenge myself in that aspect. But as I said before, a little too much apricot jam, so it's a bit too tart. But this is something I will definitely serve in Valentine's Day. All I need to do is find a girlfriend, which is arguably the hardest part. Anyways guys, thanks for watching and I hope you try this at home if my instructions are clear enough.